Hello everyone, my name's Josh, and I'm a game designer. Because I'm a game designer, I've had to play a lot of games over my career. More card games than anything, strangely enough. Pokemon, Magic, Vanguard, Lightsworns, Duel Masters, they've all held my on-again, off-again attention for various amounts of time. But the one card game whose grip I can never truly escape from is Yu-Gi-Oh! From the fan perspective, it surrounded me with friends who I still talk with today, introduced me to YouTube, and remains a consistent hobby of my life. From the game design perspective, Yu-Gi-Oh! Presents a more interesting question of, how have you lived this long? The biggest crack in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s 2+ decades of history is the power creep, coming up with new cards, new mechanics that render older collections more and more useless. Konami, realizing this caveat in its fantastic business strategy, regularly releases new support for these older groups of cards. In theory, it's a win-win. Newer fans get their hands on older cards, and older fans get their favorite deck to shine in the spotlight for its 15 minutes of fame. Sometimes it happens in little sprinkles, other times it's the marketing for an entire set. Sometimes it actually revolutionizes the deck for the modern age, and most of the time it relegates the deck to casual tier. What's more interesting to me is the rate. How frequently does the new stuff for old stuff come out? Sometimes you have a group of cards stuck in a drought for half a decade, while others have cut out the middleman and just tapped right into the waterline. Taking a microscope and examining this microcosm is what we'll be talking about in this series. Groups of cards, better known as archetypes, and how they've changed and melded over time in all sorts of ways. How the fans have reacted to them, the success they were able to generate, and most importantly, why they kept getting new stuff. A while back I pulled Reddit and Facebook, and while there were a large variety of archetypes, the most popular were Infernoids, 6 Samurai, and the topic of today's episode, the heavenly vanguard that opposes evil, Lightsworn. Welcome to deck design. My goal here is to dissect an archetype and see why it appeals to players in the game design / theory mindset. Card analysis will likely and most definitely be a part, but not to the extent of something like Archetype Archive or Legacy of the Worthless. Most of what I'll be talking about is from my own analysis. I'm going off of my own anecdotes with the cards, how I've seen people interact with them, how people have told me they interact with them, and tying it together nicely with some game theory logic behind it. So with that, let's jump right into... Okay, so the only real lore we've gotten from Lightsworn was from a storage box. Not even a master guide? Alright then, what do we have here? O Saint Michael, Archangel of the Light, with the mighty dragon of judgment in thou command, we praise thou as our guardian. Save us in the holy battles, decisively defeat the forces from the darkness. Then we pray, thou be our ark, thou be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the darkness. They appear across time and space, answering the prayers of the innocent and those who wish for peace. By consuming vast quantities of magical energy, they appear on the material plane and challenge those evildoers who threaten the era they appear in. Once their job is done and the evil has been stopped, they return home to their plane, disappearing without a trace. This entire snippet is about the most we've ever gotten out from the lore, save for some brief facts about certain members. Raiko is Jane's dog, Rinian is Lumina's cat, and it turns out big old Judgment Dragon is just the level 60 mount from Michael the Lightsworn. Raiden is their one-man ninja army. Effect monster Minerva becomes Minerva the Xyz monster down the road. The Lightsworns are described very similarly to the Valkyries in the way they take worthy souls on their death to add to their army. In terms of aesthetics, the Lightsworn stayed pretty consistent throughout their lifetime. Other archetypes introduced during the GX era, like Ancient Gears and 6 Samurai, had more clear evolution and change in their aesthetic as time passed. Ancient Gear had a period of losing their aged appearance and became sleeker with their support gained from the Arc 5 anime. And 6 Samurai evolved by taking brighter colors in their art as the archetype evolved over time, instead of restricted to just neon highlights like in the first wave. With the Lightsworns, they've consistently stuck to the white armor with gold accents. For their less human members, they're almost always white and wearing the same off-white and gold armor. If you're trying to communicate an association with godly or heavenly appearances, it's not the most original, but it does get the message across. In stark contrast, most of GX's inspirations were much more science fiction heavy from both modern and old, as well as some of the tried and true Yu-Gi-Oh! Brand of monsters. You had modern sci-fi and cyber dragons, cyber angels, the entire Neo series, and some of the elemental heroes. You had old sci-fi like steampunk with Ancient Gears, and a large focus on elemental manipulation like Animale's Alchemy series, the Charmers, or Bastion's elemental dinosaurs. You had clearly Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters with Dark World, Sacred Beasts, and the Sky Scourge. Of course, you did have some out-of-place lines like Battery Men and Roids, but there was a focus to lean on more modern sources of fiction. Because Lightsworns were presented as a mishmash of different creatures banding together, Lightsworns just had, well, everything. And speaking of having everything. To set the scene, let's flash back to 2008. a year that collectively saw the release of hit movies like The Dark Knight, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Beverly Hills Chihuahua, Madagascar 2, Escape to Africa, and Twilight. It also saw the release of Live Destruction, the 27th Yu-Gi-Oh! Set to see released in the US, and where Lightsworns were first introduced. Lightsworns started, and still continue to be one of the strangest on-the-surface mechanics in any card game, sending cards from the top of your deck to the trash, better known as self-milling. I say strangest because in almost every card game, the objective is rarely ever to run out of cards in your deck. While a few cards in Magic the Gathering break this norm, and you could argue Exodia decks work very similarly since you have to draw most of your deck to get all the pieces, in the typical game it's certainly not to deck out before the opponent. Almost every card game has a rule saying something to the effect of, when your deck runs out of cards and you attempt to draw, you lose. The balance to losing your resources faster is that they're on average more powerful, so you aren't as reliant on seeing all of them. You can afford to let some of them never see the field. Lightsworn, at least back in the beginning, definitely had the power to prove that. Their boss monster Judgment Dragon was at the time, and still arguably, the pinnacle of strong boss monster design. Attack equal to Blue Eyes White Dragon, not too shabby defense, a stupid easy summoning condition in a deck all about getting your own cards from the deck into the graveyard, a pretty cheap effect that dropped a nuke on the field, and the biggest of all, basically no restrictions. It was even stronger when priority was around. A quick aside. Priority was a facet in the older rules that was basically a way to circumvent cards that didn't outright stop the summon. As an example, if I summon Judgment Dragon and you activate Trap Hole, I can still use the nuke effect before he gets destroyed. But if you played something to outright stop the summon, I can't do that. It's no longer a part of the game, but this was a huge game rule when it was first released that impacted how you could interact with your opponent. So that last part of no restrictions was huge. Nowadays a card of this degree might have some restrictions like, you can only summon this once per turn, or you can only use this destruction effect once per turn. With JD, you can get 3 of them out on the same turn, just don't use the nuke effect if they're all out on the field. Oh, and the nuke effect isn't even once per turn! If your opponent had something that protected itself a few times, no biggie, just sink your entire life into it and pretend you're playing Fallout. Lightsworn's other monsters were pretty versatile for the time too. Lila could destroy pesky back row when you didn't have the nuclear option, Lumina could fill your board with stuff from your graveyard, Raikou had slower monster removal, but that's okay, the game was slower then. Gareth helped you draw cards and was just pretty big, Aaron gave the middle finger to other face-down monsters, and Celestia was a decent tribute summon for the time. No Monarch, but it filled your graveyard on summon and had no restriction of what to destroy. Wolf was a little weird and fell victim to the unspoken rule of level 4 monsters, over 2000 attack and it has some sort of drawback. But he did what the archetype wanted, congratulating you for milling your deck. Most of the time he was fodder for Lumina, Solar Recharge, or you drew him and you just felt bad. The less popular Lightsworn monsters still have their niche uses. Arcus protected your field from destruction, Garganth was just a poor man's Judgment Dragon, and Jane was a slightly stronger Garroth that could just mill on his own. Believe it or not, this was all within the first wave of support they had in Light Destruction. They didn't stay quiet for too long though, getting some more support in the very next set, the advent of the 5D series, the Duelist Genesis. Most of what they got was nothing really noteworthy. Genesis gave them healing they neither asked for nor needed. Lightsworn Saber was a very niche equip, and some traps that never really saw play. But the best piece of support they did get was Charge of the Light Brigade, a searcher for the archetype that also milled. Instant 3-0 for the deck, until it got limited, then semi-limited, but now it's back to 3. They kept quiet for the next few years until mid-2014, where their own structure deck was released. This was deep in the new structure deck design philosophy, a greater focus on series and archetypes, rather than just general types or attribute support. And with that support, they gained 4 new cards. Raiden, the go-to tuner that had the benefit of milling before the end phase. Minerva, another tuner that had some utility, but in most cases was outclassed by Raiden. Lightsworn Sanctuary, a spell that in theory could help them, but never really meshed with the playstyle. And finally, their big secondary boss monster, Michael the Arc Lightsworn. He's riding Judgment Dragon, banishes 1 card instead of destroying everything, restores life, and shuffles stuff back into the deck on death? A little weird, but okay. Only caveat is that the whole life gain effect, while useful so you can keep buying nukes from JD's toolshed, doesn't really make sense for the rest of the archetype flavor-wise. Genis healed with light magic, sure, and their supposed leader also heals? It's a little incongruous to say the least. Around the same time, they picked up a little bit more support that was imported from Japan in the form of Felice the Archer. Same problem as Wolf, where you can't regularly summon it from the hand, but attributes itself to mill and pop cards. Overall, pretty good card for the archetype. Not so much flavor-wise, but it works. Felice's debut is soon overshadowed by some good news and some bad news to the archetype. In their Infinite Judgment, Konami decided to import their Japanese exclusive Minerva, the Exalted Lightsworn, to America. But it was only released as a prize card. Bit of a shame too, it matched the archetype almost to a T for flavor and function. It milled outside of the end phase by detaching, letting you draw cards for each Lightsworn you mill. When it died, it milled some more and popped cards if you milled more Lightsworns. but it cost about as much as a month's rent. They never really explained why Minerva got the prize card treatment, but it finally got a wider release through Battles of Legend. At the dawn of Link summoning, another year or so down the line, the Lightsworn became a little darker. Maybe to emphasize the graveyard-focused strategies using Lightsworn over the years, Konami just said, we'll just give it to you. So from I'll have her home by 9, sir, to she calls me daddy too, we have the Twilightsworn. Unlike the mill strategy, the Dark Cousins prefer banishing Lightsworns from hand or graveyard to feel their effects. Also, instead of just letting them mill on their own, they mill whenever a fellow Lightsworn mills. And JD got the Hot Topic treatment too, becoming Punishment Dragon, who punishes everyone by making them go home to the deck if they're banished or in the graveyard. I don't get it either. Even their edgy twist on Charge of the Light Brigade, March of the Dark Brigade, had you grab Lightsworns from the graveyard but then banish the top cards rather than milling them. It's safe to say that Konami agreed that Twilightsworns were very much a failed experiment in flavor and function, as we haven't seen any since. Fast forward a bit in time, and Konami Japan drops the Link Brains pack. The intent was giving archetypes of yore the boost they needed to start competing in the new era of Link summoning, some needing it much more than others. Ultimately, Lightsworn joined this prestigious first group and received Curios, the Lightsworn Dominion, whereas some of the stuff released in Link Brains either had mechanical conflict or flavor conflicts with its archetype, Konami did not let Lightsworn down here. So ultimately, save for their Twilightsworn phase, Lightsworn never really abandoned their core principles, milling cards and rewarding the player for it. But for as many cards as Konami can give an archetype, it's all moot if those cards never get sleeved up and hit the table. Lightsworns have always had some tournament presence since they first came out in May 2008. In June, they'd have their first success by reaching the top 8, and a month later was that year's World Championship. Despite being in a field dominated by Dark Armed Dragon and Gladiator Beast decks, the archetype took 7 of the top 32 spots, but ultimately made it to the quarterfinals. Lightsworn decks around this time were still struggling to decide on what cards to run and what quantities. What became unanimous was playing a small group of dark monsters that could really help out the deck. Necrogardener lets you avoid attacks by removing it from the graveyard. Sangan lets you search for the smaller attack value Lightsworns. Both let you get away with playing the pre-errata Crush card Virus, arguably one of the strongest trap cards ever printed in the game, just due to its deck-destroying effects. Following the World Championships, the rest of the year saw tournaments dominated by variants of Teledad. The deck was able to abuse the new Synchro Summoning mechanic, using minimal resources to quickly summon new level 6 and 8 Synchro monsters. When you combine that to the natural power of Dark Armed Dragon, the lack of resources available to contest it, and the deck's just stupid consistency, you have one of the strongest decks in the game's history. At Shonen Jump Tulsa, Lightsworn took 3 out of the top 16 spots. Gladiator Beasts and Zombies each took 1 apiece, and Teledad took the rest. The next month, Lightsworn only eked out 1 spot in the top 16 in a field dominated by Teledad. For the rest of the year, Lightsworn would have a consistent presence in tournament play, and over time, Lightsworn would even start using popular dark monsters like Dark Armed Dragon to improve the power of the deck. This led to the offshoot Twilightsworns. This name would serve as the basis for cards later on, and use dark and light monsters in tandem to abuse powerful chaos monsters. Moving to the next year, Teledad was still dominating the tournament scene. Konami decided that this was enough, and finally dropped the banhammer to the deck. The eponymous Dark Armed Dragon and Emergency Teleport were forced to 1 per deck. Other important draw cards and helpful monsters were each put to 2 copies per deck. The dragon had been slain, but new champions quickly rose in the power vacuum. Shonen Jump Anaheim, a month later, proved to be Lightsworn's best showing thus far, making a 2nd place finish. So close. And so close is probably the best way to sum up Lightsworn's performance that year. While it could compete with the new top dogs like Black Wings and Synchro Cat, the deck could never get that 1st place finish it so desperately wanted, placing 3rd and 4th at the California Nationals in July, taking 3 top 16 spots in the US Nationals, also in July, and 4 top 16 spots in October, Shonen Jump Austin with a top 8 finish. Finally, in November 2009, following the September's ban list removal of threats like Synchro Cat and weakening Black Wings, along with putting Chaos Sorcerer to 2, it was time. Lightsworn swept through Shonen Jump Columbus, taking 6th of the top 16 spots, 1 reaching top 8, and finally a Twilightsworn deck taking 1st place. Moving into the new decade, Lightsworns again dominated Shonen Jump LA by taking half the top 16, along with the 1st, 2nd, and 4th place finishes. This was the first time Zombiesworn was really shown, using Lightsworn's natural deck dumping properties to get zombies to do their thing in the graveyard. Despite this, 2010 was Lightsworn's last real showing for a while. Following the 2 sweeps, the deck started losing tournament presence until we reached an interesting period in the deck's life. Due to all the self-milling, a lot of decks really wanted that. Lightsworn would soon find new life, not as a deck in itself, but working as a small engine in other decks to get their cards in the graveyard. Chaos Dragons would be the first big deck to use this strategy in 2012, using self-milling to fuel the summons of strong dragons and chaos monsters. In 2014, we find Dragon Rulers, another contender in the argument of best deck of all time. This seems off topic, but stay with me. Konami, seeing how the deck almost single-handedly dominated the last 6 months of competitive play, limits or bans multiple pieces in the deck's arsenal, including the quartet of Dragon Rulers. Now, with each ruler limited, the deck needed a way to get back on its feet, and so passes Lightsworns. The new Lightsworn ruler deck was not nearly as omnipresent as its previous form, but it became a frequent mainstay of tournaments. From May to September, the deck would find some place on the top 16, sometimes even winning the tournament, like YCS Mississippi in July and YCS Oregon in August. Lightsworn still wasn't out of the picture yet. The new spell card That Grass Looks Greener incentivized a first for Yu-Gi-Oh! 60-card decks. While the deck limit was always capped at 60, it was statistically better to play closer to the 40-card minimum. But when you have a card that lets you mill sometimes 20 cards with no drawback, it tends to get used. Many raced to find the best deck to use the new card, and while it wasn't Lightsworns, they definitely benefited from it. Soon we started seeing stranger 50-card builds that were trying to be a bit more consistent than the 60-card versions, but wanted to get some free mills compared to the 40-card. In the recent game though, Lightsworn card showings have dwindled from top-tier play. Their last real showing was in the top 8 dedicated Lightsworn deck in the Chesterfield, England regional. Ultimately, since Lightsworn rulers fell out of favor at the end of 2014, the archetype has seen little to no play on its own. Did the deck have any room to keep its identity and become its own deck again? Unfortunately, that seems a bit unlikely. With the power creep of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the game has become extremely fast compared to a decade ago when Lightsworn was first introduced. The name of the game has become going first, how many effect negations can you get out, and going second, how can I destroy the opponent's board to build my own? Following a very recent ban list, it looks even more unlikely for the deck to come back. Eclipse Wyvern, which for the longest time served as a way to get Judgment Dragon more consistently, has been banned. Is there anything Konami can do on their end to make Lightsworns great again? Well, the obvious is to allow it to facilitate easy-to-make, negate-heavy boards, but that's not fun for either the players or likely the designers. So a potential solution is to make the deck less reliant on the once per turn normal summon, or giving them ways to get extra summons for more advantage. The ultimate problem with Lightsworn design is that self-milling is a mechanic that can play well with a large variety of decks and strategies. The challenge becomes making something powerful enough for solely Lightsworn decks to play, rather than the semi-regular misstep of making something that can be slotted into multiple decks. While you could add a restriction to the effect of, you can only summon Lightsworn monsters the turn you activate this card or effect, then the new problem arises in that you can't use strong generic monsters in your Lightsworn strategies. If you take the Dueling Book's custom cards to see what players have thought up of, you find a mixed bag. Most cards give you a way to search the deck for Judgment Dragon, others try to maximize the amount of milling the deck can achieve. A few of them try to flip the milling in the opposite direction and force the opponent to mill too. A surprising amount try to tamper with fusion strategies that ultimately circumvent fusion requirements altogether. Some just try to do way too much. Look, all I'm trying to say is, Konami, give Lightsworn the love of a neat freak mom. Everything the deck needs, but it can only stay in the house. Don't go over to Little Dino Deck's house and get his dirty fingers all over it, and I don't trust the zombies and their family around your stuff. I think Konami really hit something that resonated with players with Lightsworn. A decade later, the cards are still popular, and some of them decorate the halls of Yu-Gi-Oh! History as solid additions to the now 10,000 plus cards in the game's lifetime. The deck's cards have been mashed together with so many well-performing decks, it's safe to say that most of the cards were the metaphorical salt and pepper to throw onto anything. The strategy of self-milling that started with Lightsworn has now become the game plan for multitudes of other archetypes, especially with how the game has evolved to be utilized in the graveyard as an effective second hand. Lightsworns, for better or for worse, helped pave the way for the strategies and card design of Yu-Gi-Oh! Used today. And I think it'd be nice if Konami gave the deck a little more love so for the first time in a very long time, it could take center stage instead of playing an extra in someone else's strategy.
Hey everyone, phone quality audio here, a month after the rest of the audio you just heard got recorded. Thanks again for sticking around until the end of the video. I wanted to get this out before I started the new college semester in September, but that didn't end up happening. I hope that despite the way you learned something or got a better understanding of why cards get designed a certain way. My goal is to get a better working of Sony Vegas so I can put out videos at a faster rate. If you have any suggestions on what to cover on the next deck design, please let me know in the comments. Big thanks to my friend and fellow game designer Gunnar for composing some of the music. All the music I used I have links to in the description. Finally, you can follow me on Twitter at JMarGameDesign, where I've been slowly getting more game design and industry thoughts to fill that barren wasteland, and at DP_Supernova, my school project team that will be the home for showing off the development process on our big senior project. Our sophomore project that went with the school to PAX West 2018, Valo Frozen Light, is up for download through the DigiPen Game Gallery. Link to that in the description too. Again, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.